Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On June 18, 1945, 1 month shy of his 59th birthday, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. became the most senior U.S. military officer to be killed by enemy fire in World War II. At the time, he was leading 10th Army on Okinawa. Buckner kept a diary from January 1, 1944 to June 17, 1945. That diary has only recently been fully published, and today we are fortunate to be able to discuss Buckner's life and service with Christopher Kolakowski, editor of 10th Army Commander, The Writings of Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., 1944 to 1945. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Looking forward to a great discussion.
So you've given presentations about the Buckner and the MacArthur families in the past. And in what ways would you say that they are similar?
Well, broadly speaking, there's a great similarity in the fact that Dad had a great service in the Civil War. Case of Arthur MacArthur, of course, the Medal of Honor on Missionary Ridge, boy colonel of the Union Army. And then Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr., a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army, probably best known for the surrender at Fort Henry and Donelson in February of 1862 to his friend U.S. Grant, but also Corps Command in Chickamauga, and also the man who engineered the surrender of all the troops in the Trans-Mississippi at the end of the war. So very prominent figure. And then, of course, the sons will later serve join the Army, later serve in World War II in very senior positions. But there are a few other examples as well. And one of the parallels is, in many ways, to understand the son, you have to understand the father. The father is very much an exemplar. Of course, MacArthur and his dad, that's very well known. But a lot of people don't realize that Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr. also encouraged his son and took his son on trips. As a matter of fact, when he was 14, they went to Europe and they visited some of the battlefields of the Franco-Prussian War and actually visited and watched Kaiser Wilhelm II review troops. And Buckner Sr. turned to his son and said, that man is going to get his country into very serious trouble one day. So there was that broadening experience, just like the MacArthurs. And then the reason Buckner ends up at West Point is through his father. His father had been politically tied and political allies with Theodore Roosevelt. And so he gets Theodore Roosevelt to appoint him to West Point. And that, of course, sets Buckner Jr. on his West Point career. And if you read the family letters, some of which I quote in the book, you can tell that Dad is vicariously living through his son. And even when his son graduates and then is stationed in the Philippines for a while, his father is giving him advice and counsel and things like that. Of course, his father dies in January of 1914 at age 90. So there's this period, and you can tell even later in the diary where, for example, the landing on Okinawa occurred on his father's birthday, April 1st. Buckner Jr. notes that in his diary. So you can tell the enduring impact. And so for both Douglas MacArthur and Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., if you want to understand one of the lights that they steer their life by, just look at their father. Look at their father and their father's service.
Can you share some biographical highlights of Buckner leading up to World War II? It seems like he had an absolutely fascinating career.
He had a remarkable life basically from day one. He was born July 18th, 1886 in central Kentucky, and his father was 62, his mother was 28. So that alone is significant. When he lives his toddler's years in the governor's mansion of Kentucky because his father is governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky from 1887 to 1891. Then he is a star at the 1896 Gold Democrat National Convention when his father is the vice presidential nominee on the Gold Democrat ticket, along with Union Major General, who's the presidential nominee, John Palmer. It's kind of a unity ticket. To this day, it has a record for being the oldest combined age of nominees. Palmer was 78, Buckner Sr. was 73. But this 10-year-old kid is the star of the show. And they actually put together a resolution and vote him the child of the democracy of the 1896 convention. And in later years, as a reporter would say, if you want to see General Buckner blush, just mention that title. But of course, they don't get elected. They finish third behind William Jennings Bryan and, of course, William McKinley. We've already talked about his West Point appointment through Theodore Roosevelt, and then serves, in the Philippines several tours, does not get overseas during World War I. He actually trains air cadets in Texas for most of it. And then in 1919, he goes to West Point. He's one of the young, smart officers that is sent to West Point to work under MacArthur as a tactical officer to rebuild the Corps of Cadets. And he and a couple of other officers basically are the ones that implement the new honor code that MacArthur formalized, a lot of his programs, and also if you look at how wrecked the Corps of Cadets was because of all the senior classes getting graduated early to go to World War I, a lot of these officers, including Buckner, are the ones who rebuild that cadet structure and actually do a lot of the, cadet honor boards and things that are normally done by cadet leaders. Those were done during that period by Buckner and a few others, even though they're commissioned officers. So he's a huge part of rebuilding West Point after World War I, which of course we talk about MacArthur his exemplary leadership. And then he spends basically the next basic decade or so of his life in Army schools, first at the Command and General Staff College. They like him so much, he's immediately brought back as a professor and as a leader. Same with the Army War College. And then he's appointed Commandant of Cadets at West Point, a job he'll hold from 1933 to 1936. And the 1936 class has a lot of your senior Vietnam leaders, William Westmoreland, Aaron Mike Michaelis. I could tick off several others as well. It's one of those prominent West Point, just like the class in 1915, it's one of those prominent West Point classes. And Buckner was their Commandant of Cadets. And then he commands troops all over the country, Alabama out to the Pacific Northwest, commands the 66th Regiment of Tanks for a while, and that gets him up to basically 1939, 1940.
Now, in 1940, he's promoted to brigadier general and he's sent to Alaska. So tell us about his service there. I feel like you could do a whole entire podcast on Alaska.
Alaska, yes, you could. It is a forgotten yet fascinating front. Alaska, most people need to realize, first of all, Alaska is 20% the size of the continental United States. So it's huge. And in 1940, when Buckner goes up there, there's actually no overland communication. In fact, the Army official history says until 1942, when the Alaska Highway opened, Alaska, for all intents and purposes, was an island, not a peninsula. The only way to get in was air and sea. When he gets there, there's been some plans for the potential defense of Alaska. People are realizing that Japan's aggression, it's beginning this belated realization that the U.S. needs to defend its outposts in the Pacific. And it's also during this time, of course, you get the first discussion of the buildup of the Philippines, the buildup of Wake Island, Guam, things like that, Hawaii. And part of that is Alaska. And George Marshall needs a good, young, energetic general who not only understands how to build, how to get things done, but also understands how to work with the civil administration, because Alaska is not a state. It won't be a state till 1959. And so how do you work with the territorial governor and do what needs to be done up there? And Simon Bolivar Buckner is the choice. And so he goes up there and basically, as one of his engineers would say, he was given a 10-year job he did in 18 months. In fact, a lot of the military installations up in Alaska, to say nothing of a lot of the highways and some of the port infrastructure, was built under Buckner's aegis. And very much, when he gets there, there's only 400 troops defending the territory. They have one cannon, and it's a Russian cannon from the 19th century that's a monument. And by the time Pearl Harbor happens, they've got a small air force of a couple of dozen planes, and they've got over 20,000 troops there, plus installations. You look at, for example, Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, the same with the posts up in Fairbanks, many of the posts along the Aleutians, all of that was built under Buckner's aegis, and basically preparing the colony or the territory for defense, because they knew the Japanese were going to come. And of course, the Japanese do come in June of 1942 as part of the Midway Aleutians operation and capture the islands of Attu and Kiska in the western part of the island, or the western part of the territory. Buckner has always advocated that Alaska would be the shortest road to Tokyo, which looks great on a map when you figure that the western end of the Aleutians is only 700 miles from Hokkaido in northern Japan. The problem is the weather, which the Japanese really quickly figure out also. The weather is so bad As a matter of fact, some meteorologists have identified if there is a part of the part of the world today that is equivalent to the red spot of Jupiter, the perpetual storm that's on Jupiter, it's the perpetual low that sits right off the southern coast of Alaska. So fog, wind. In fact, a lot of those islands, it's so windy, trees can't grow. So imagine being stationed out there. I mean, it's pretty barren stuff. But this is where, of course, the Aleutians campaign will be fought. It's a nasty fight. You're fighting the elements as much as you are the enemy. Actually, proportionally, the retaking of Attu in May of 1943, by proportion to the troops engaged, is the equivalent of Iwo Jima in 1945 in terms of losses. It's that intense and that bloody. And it's fought in one of the more remote areas, certainly, of the world. But Buckner has a big hand in that, working with the air commanders, working with the naval commanders, working with, all of his subordinates, trying to coordinate this operation. In addition, of course, you think about 1942, 43, there's a lot of other things going on around the world, and they're, lower down on the priority list. Buckner does a pretty good job working with people. Notably, he gets into a quarrel with a guy named Robert Theobald, who was the first naval commander who was sent up there. Theobald had been the destroyer commander at Pearl Harbor and afterwards distrusted intelligence. After that intelligence failure, as far as he was concerned, intelligence had nothing to say. So Robert Theobald, when he gets there, he antagonizes the Army folks by asking that the maps be put on the bulkhead, not the wall, by pointedly using naval terminology. He also, because of his experience at Pearl Harbor and the intelligence failure, is convinced that intelligence has nothing to tell him. And so with all the great code breaking that has revealed not only the invasion of Midway plans, but also the invasion of the Aleutians, Buckner and all the Army folks and most of the folks in Alaska totally believe it. But Theobald doesn't. He tells his staff, this is too much to actually be genuine. This is a Japanese deception. They can't really mean this. And so that's the beginning of a really bad relationship between Buckner and Theobald. Buckner works really well with people that want to take the fight to the enemy and are committed to taking the fight to the enemy. And Theobald doesn't seem to be that person. Now, when Thomas Kinkaid, who of course will later command 7th Fleet under MacArthur, takes over in the fall of 1942, Buckner and Kinkaid get along great. As a matter of fact, they live together. They send messages back and forth to their headquarters and always say Buckner concurs or Kinkaid concurs or whatever. It becomes a great relationship and goes to great lengths to explain why the Aleutians campaign was so successful.
One of the things that I noted in the early part of the diary was that he's traveling so much in Alaska. These great distances again. And I think, people forget that in New Guinea and in the Southwest Pacific Theater with MacArthur, what a huge place this is. But then just, in Alaska, and especially with some of the weather conditions, it just seemed dangerous as well. He's going from place to place. You're getting stuck overnight somewhere because of something. You've got to be very careful with the aircraft in this weather. And so it just struck me as a very dangerous, in some ways, maybe underappreciated, just Herculean effort that he has to put in Alaska during the war.
That's true. Actually, even today with modern technology, Alaska is very treacherous flying. And just so our listeners have an idea of the size of the territory, if you take away the Aleutians, Alaska is still roughly a square, 800 miles wide by 900 miles long. So it's huge. And he's one of those people that likes to get out and have his hands and be seen, but also see what's going on. And that requires a lot of time in the air. And in some cases, you're right. There's one point where they have to travel by boat because the air bases are closed because of fog and weather and everything like that. So it is very as one of the newsmen who interviewed Buckner in 1943, he described in his article, he says that Buckner comes across very much, because Buckner liked to be an outdoorsman too, so he's very well suited for the command. And the reporter said Buckner came across very similar to Alaska, rugged, uninhabited, and hard. And that describes Alaska very well. Even today, in large measure, that describes Alaska very well.
Interesting. All right. Well, then he's going to have a pretty dramatic change of scenery because in June 1944, he's ordered to Hawaii to command 10th Army. What is the situation then in the Pacific at this time?
So June of 44 is a very interesting time in the Pacific. The Southwest Pacific Drive is really getting going. You've had the victories at Hollandia and Itape. You've got the landing at Biak. MacArthur is leapfrogging along the west coast, or the northwest coast of New Guinea, back toward the Philippines. At the same time, the Central Pacific Drive is really getting into steam. You've had the victories in the Gilberts. You've had the victories in the Marshalls. And now they're aiming for the Mariana Islands, which is a key base both for naval base, but also it will, if the captured, there will be bomber bases, and ultimately that's where the atomic bombings of Japan and the B-29 offensive will be launched from. So that happens June 15th. The Central Pacific is getting larger. Their battles are getting more extensive. You had Tarawa in 1942. That was a division-sized attack. You have a corps-sized attack in the Marshalls. And now you're starting to see multi-corps be used, Marine Corps level headquarters, but also creation of the 24th Army Corps in the Central Pacific. And so it becomes clear as the battles are moving further west, there needs to be a field army headquarters to help guide and direct those operations. Particularly when you think about what the future jumps from the Marianas will be, perhaps Okinawa, perhaps Formosa, Taiwan, objectives, China coast, which is a potential discussion. There's going to be a need for field army. So they create 10th Army in 1944, and George Marshall is the one who decides that Buckner is the guy for it. And so Buckner is sent to Honolulu, and he actually opens his headquarters and formally assumes command July 5th, 1944. And so that's the rationale. And one of the reasons that Buckner is the choice is because of the success he had working with the Navy. We should not forget that the Central Pacific is Chester Nimitz's command. So it's a naval theater. And so the Army will answer to an admiral. And that's how the chain of command is set up. Buckner will answer to Nimitz for when and where to fight. Administratively, he falls under U.S. Army Forces Pacific Ocean Areas, which is under the command of a guy named Robert Richardson, who Buckner knew because that was Buckner's predecessor as Commandant of Cadets at West Point. And Nellie Richardson, the thing about Nellie Richardson is he's also the governor of Hawaii, and his command is somewhat limited, partly because he's governor of Hawaii. He has authority over training, supply, everything about the Army in the Central Pacific, except the actual authority to lead soldiers in battle. That has primarily been the job of the Marines, the 5th Amphibious Corps under Holland Smith, like it will be again for the Mariana invasion, and 3rd Amphibious Corps under Roy Geiger. But as more Army forces are arriving, 10th Army is coming in. But Buckner realizes at the end of the day, he realizes very quickly, at the end of the day, Richardson will provide me the Army, but Nimitz is the one who will provide me the objective and the battlefield to use it on. So that's something that should be mentioned. And it's because of that complexity, and because Buckner had already demonstrated in Alaska that he could work in a complex inter-service and political environment and get people to work together. I'm convinced that's one of the reasons Marshall tapped him as the guy to take over.
That's almost another podcast in itself as well.
Yes, it is.
So you've already touched on this, but could you describe Buckner's leadership style a little bit more and talk about his reputation among his peers? And the main reason I ask is because in a July 5th, 1944 diary entry, he mentions being put in charge of what becomes known as the Buckner Board, the inquiry into the relief of 27th Infantry Division Commander Major General Ralph Smith by Marine Lieutenant General Holland Smith during the fighting on Saipan. And Buckner, in his diary entry, says that this is a delicate assignment. And that's an understatement. I mean, when you think about some of the issues there. So is he chosen because he can thread the needle carefully, or is there maybe another reason for his choice?
That's a great question. And actually, I think it comes down to who does the appointing. Richardson is the one who appoints the Buckner Board. And you need to understand that Nellie Richardson did not care for the Marines. Everybody talks about how the Holland Smith notoriously is prejudiced against Army troops. The same is true in the other way for Richardson. And so Richardson, I think, appoints Buckner for two reasons. Number one, he knows Buckner quarreled with Robert Theobald, and it had almost cost Buckner his job, but it cost anyway. Buckner was getting results, Theobald wasn't, and that's how Buckner kept his job. But Richardson looks at this and says, this guy doesn't like the Navy. So there's that piece. But the other thing is Richardson realizes the best chance I have to actually lead troops in battle is if I can get Buckner out of the way In fact, the MacArthur archives in 1945, Richardson is writing to MacArthur asking for a field command in the invasion of Japan. And he's making absolutely no bones about it. So basically, here comes this commander from Alaska. Richardson views him as a threat. And so here's this hot potato. And, it's a situation, if you study the Smith versus Smith controversy, and there's a great book Harry Gailey wrote called Howlin' Mad Smith versus the Army, that is outstanding explanation of it. It was very serious. It threatened a rupture between the Army and the Navy in the Central Pacific. It was nasty, and it is to the credit of leaders like Buckner and Nimitz, Marshall, and even Ernest King up in Washington when everything gets there, to tamp it down and to not let this thing really blow up, even though it did get into the papers a little bit, to say, hey, we need to win the war. We need to get this out of the way. And that's one of the things Buckner very quickly realizes is he says, I have to, this is delicate, as he points out, but I have to put the greater good up here. Several of his board members and Richardson, and if you read the diary, you can tell Richardson is talking to him quite a few times. How's it going? What are you finding out? And, the message is clear, come down hard on the Marines. But Buckner realizes we're going to still have to fight together to win Japan. There's still a war to be won. We can't let these squabbles get in the way. And so he works very hard with his board members to moderate the report. And just as a quick side note, during this period, Richardson goes to Saipan to decorate the 27th Division and hand out decorations, and gets into a shouting match with some of the senior commanders over the Holland Smith's relief of Ralph Smith. So that gives you an idea of the atmosphere that all this is happening. And Buckner ultimately, the way he threads the needle is he says that Holland Smith, as the overall commander on the island, had the authority to do what he did, but he was, quote, not fully informed of the conditions in the 27th Division zone, unquote. And so that's how he kind of moderates the whole thing. It ends up going up to the War Department. We talked about Marshall and King already. It does linger because in October, when they're talking about actually employing 10th Army, Nimitz calls Buckner in and asks him point blank. He probably already knew the answer to the question, but asks him point blank and says, what do you think of the whole Smith versus Smith thing? Where are you on this? How do you feel about the Marines? How do you feel about where are you? And Buckner says, he says, as Nimitz, finding I deplored the whole thing, Nimitz put me in command of the next project, which would ultimately be the invasion of Okinawa. So it hangs on that long. The relief is in June. Here we are, October. It still impacts everything. It's interesting to note, by the way, that Holland Smith never commanded troops directly in battle again. He was kicked upstairs to the administrative post of Fleet Marine Force. And Richardson and actually Marshall both said that major Army units will not go into battle under Holland Smith's command again. And so it did have an impact on Holland Smith for sure. But it could have been a lot worse, and it could have been a lot more widespread. But Buckner was able to thread that needle. He understood what he had to do, even if Richardson didn't want it to go another way. But he understood both what's best for the war effort, but also what was best for him personally.
Buckner's in Hawaii when Franklin Roosevelt comes to discuss the next phase of the Pacific War with Nimitz and MacArthur in July 1944. How does that meeting, and we've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but how does that meeting determine the next phase then of Buckner's service?
That meeting is critical because there's a strategic debate, as we've touched on, of the next objectives. Because as the Central Pacific Drive moves west from the Marianas and MacArthur's drive aims for the Philippines, the question becomes, those two are going to converge, and where's the objective area? And it basically comes down to two areas: the Philippines, Luzon, or do you take Formosa and land on the China coast? That's Operation Causeway. And as a matter of fact, the staff study for Operation Causeway, Buckner is handed on the day he assumes command of 10th Army. In fact, he's the ground commander designate for Causeway. And it's a very interesting staff study, it's available online. Take the southern half of Formosa with one corps, you take the other corps, and you land it on the Amoy, Xiamen, on the China coast to secure a port to support Chiang Kai-shek's armies. And so that's the causeway objective. And the idea is you take you do one of those two. You either do the Philippines or you do Operation Causeway to secure that part of the Pacific, cut the Japanese off from their resources in the southern Pacific, and then you turn and you finish the job in the home islands. So that's the debate. It's still going on, and Franklin Roosevelt, who has just been nominated a fourth term as president, goes to Pearl Harbor to meet with Nimitz and MacArthur to discuss and debate the merits of each objective. And Nimitz, because his boss is Ernest King and who really favors Formosa, argues for Operation Causeway. MacArthur, of course, argues for the Philippines and makes for what I consider to be some very, very good cases. And come out of the meeting with everybody feeling like the Philippines is the place to go. The problem is Ernest King continues to be a stick in the mud about Causeway. And ultimately, Buckner is one of the key players in turning for the cancellation of Causeway. When he and his staff sit down and look at it and say, you know what? We are going to need service units, port units, supply units. We're going to need all of this that are not available in theater and are on their way to Europe. So either you pause the war in Europe so that we can take this island. And by the way, we're not going to be able to do it till March 1st anyway, even with these reinforcements. Or you go to the Philippines, like MacArthur wants in the fall, which you can do with forces on hand. And ultimately, that is the key thing that turns King away from Causeway. Because the Allied priority, of course, Germany first. You're not going to stop the war in Europe to execute an operation in the spring of 1945. And Buckner is one of the ones who points that out. And so once Causeway is canceled, what's the next objective? And so the Central Pacific forces, while MacArthur is liberating the Philippines, the Central Pacific forces decide we're going to secure a couple of islands as jump-off points and support points for an eventual invasion of the home islands. And that'll lead, of course, to the Operation Detachment, which will be the Battle of Iwo Jima, and then Operation Iceberg, which will be the Battle of Okinawa. And the project that Nimitz orders Buckner to take command of is Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. So the short answer is what happens in July at Pearl Harbor. And by the way, Buckner is involved. His diary talks about having lunch with the president, things like that. He's very much involved in some of the events around the visit, was critical to his future.
Walk us through Buckner's time on Okinawa and then the events of June 18th, 1944.
So Buckner leads 10th Army, 183,000, 50% of which are Army troops, 50% of which are Marines in the 3rd Amphibious Corps, leads them ashore April 1st, 1945. And they're expecting heavy resistance on the beach. But the commander, the Japanese commander, a man named Ushijima, who along with Yamashita and Hama, are, for my money, the three best Japanese Army commanders the U.S. faces in the Pacific, decides that he's going to bleed the Americans and lure them into a trap in southern Okinawa, where he's put most of his defenses. And so most of Buckner's troops are expecting to take 2 weeks to fight their way even across the island, which is only a few miles wide at that point. They're able to do that in 3 days with very little losses. And so Buckner aggressively hits out with his army and sends the Marines to secure northern Okinawa, which was supposed to be a later objective. And then turns south and runs into the heavy defenses of the Japanese. And it becomes what as one of his corps commanders would say, we have to blast them out yard by yard. And Buckner is going to rely on firepower and superior American tactics, including offshore gunfire, to get his way through. His army will adopt what he called blowtorch and corkscrew tactics to deal with Japanese caves and defenses. The blowtorch is exactly what you think. Put gasoline down in it and throw a grenade or a satchel charge in there to burn out the occupants. Corkscrew is to use explosives to seal the cave mouth and let the defenders suffocate that way. It'll be slow but steady progress. Just as 10th Army is about to break through in mid-May at that place called Shuri at the ancient Okinawan capital, rain will set in. It'll rain an inch a day for 15 days. And so they'll be stuck in the mud, and that'll enable the Japanese to retreat. Ultimately, the 10th Army will succeed in capturing Okinawa in about 90 days of fighting, but it will be incredibly costly. It is the bloodiest single battle of the Pacific War to that point. 49,000 Americans killed, wounded, captured, and missing, both on the island and offshore. Of the 120,000 Japanese defenders, over 110,000 are killed. Some of them are suicide, some of them in battle. Ushijima and his staff, of course, commit suicide at the end of the battle. 7,000 prisoners are taken, which is more in that battle than the rest of the Pacific War combined, which is an interesting comment on war weariness among many of the Japanese. Of the 400,000 Okinawan civilians, Okinawa, by the way, being a prefecture of Japan, over 82,000 were killed during the battle, some of them by suicide as well, jumping off the cliffs and things like that. Some of them just caught up in the fighting. So the island and the waters around it run very red with blood. And that could be a whole talk in itself, is the Battle of Okinawa. And certainly the casualties are a factor in the estimates for the invasion of Japan, but also for the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Both the Americans and the Japanese regarded the Battle of Okinawa as a full dress rehearsal for the invasion of Japan. And Buckner was the central land commander on the American side. He does not survive the battle. To answer the second part of your question, Buckner was one of those people that liked to visit the front. He liked to, particularly when new units were going into action for the first time or a critical attack was going on, he liked to be up front to observe. And if you see in the diary, he does a lot of that. On the morning of June 18th, the 8th Marine Regiment is going into action for the first time on Okinawa, and he goes up to visit them and to watch them in action. And he goes to the regimental observation post in the southwestern part of the island, talks to some of the Marines, and one of the officers there says, the visit of the 10th Army commander did a great deal for our morale. So Buckner goes up, he watches the regiment in action for about an hour or so. He's filmed, he's also photographed during this time. And he's standing at the end of the hill right by a coral boulder, and he looks around, he's watching it, he says, things are going so well here, I think I'll move on to another unit. Immediately after that, a Japanese artillery round strikes the coral rock next to him, knocks all the officers on the hill down, and drives a piece of coral right into his chest. He begins gasping for air, asks if everybody else is okay, is happy to hear that, is carried down the back slope where the regimental surgeon begins to work on him. And unfortunately, he gasps his last breaths and dies on a stretcher. A Marine, as Buckner is trying to stand up and is reaching for anybody as he's laying there, a Marine grasps his hand, and the last thing Buckner hears, "You're going home, General. You are homeward bound." And that's what that Marine repeats as Buckner gasps his last breath. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. is the senior American killed by enemy fire in World War II and in the 20th century. And he died shortly after noon on June 18th, 1945. He's ultimately succeeded first by Roy Geiger, who is the only Marine and the only aviator of any service to command a field army in combat. He'll command for a few days as interim commander, which is what Buckner wanted. Buckner had said, if something happens, Geiger's my man. And then Joseph Stilwell takes over 10th Army. It's ultimately MacArthur and Marshall negotiate that, and Stilwell will actually finish the battle. But that's Buckner. His career ends there in a very obviously sudden and untimely fashion.
One of the things that I particularly liked in the book was where you include the letters, that he wrote shortly before his death, and then some of the letters that his wife, or I guess one letter that she receives, just explaining his death and how it happened, and that he's going to write their son at West Point and let him know. Yes. I thought those letters were just really well placed throughout to give a kind of a human sense of what was happening. We know that some commanders wrote memoirs of their service in World War I after the war, and some didn't. And this has clearly impacted our understanding of the war, I think, in many ways. And you can probably speak to that as well. But what do you think Buckner's diary adds to our understanding of the war in the Pacific?
Buckner's death erased two key parts of two chapters of the Pacific War, Alaska and Okinawa. If you look at many histories of particularly the Battle of Okinawa, it's kind of written around Buckner. Buckner's voice is missing. He's kind of observed from the outside. Whereas if you look at some of the other campaigns where the commanders wrote their memoirs or wrote papers, for example, Eisenhower in Europe, even the campaigns of Patton where his papers have been published, or Eichelberger and Kruger in the Pacific, their voice is in there. And so by putting these out, and you've actually touched on it already, it provides an understanding of Buckner first as a man, as a husband, as a father. So you get that sense of who he was, but his comments in the diary lend a great deal of understanding both of the life in Hawaii during the war, life in Alaska during the war, inter-service politics, some of the gossip and some of the things that he hears about, particularly his comments about the Battle of Leyte Gulf and some of the what he overhears about some of the controversies at that battle, to say nothing then, of course, of preparing 10th Army, going and then taking it into battle, some of his comments about strategy. It's a missing voice. And this is the only part of that voice that can be brought forward today. And so that's what I was trying to do in the book, was trying to get people to even just see and understand who this man was. You know, he was going to write a memoir after the war, but these are the only words he's left us. And it's important to have it out there, because if you're going to understand who this man was, what better way to do it than by looking at his writings? And that's why I wanted to edit and get this book out there, is because I think it fills as best we can an important gap among some of the key leaders in the Pacific, for sure.
100% agree on that. It is a very good addition to our understanding. Any final thoughts?
Well, I appreciate you having me on. There's obviously a lot more to be said about World War II. Anybody that thinks, oh, the last word's been written or there's nothing more to say, obviously there's still a lot out there. And it's not just Buckner. If you look at some of the other senior commanders in the Pacific, they're not as studied as much as Europe, but it's a fascinating theater. And when you think about potential future conflict areas, the lessons of World War II may very well be relevant to a potential future conflict in the Pacific. And the lessons of Okinawa definitely are being looked at by the military. So any increasing understanding we can have of that war, which has done so much to make the modern world, it's going to be more and more important, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to join us today. That was really very interesting.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.